We have spent the last several videos on a pair of early 20th century political systems that were simultaneously highly competitive but also fairly stable. Competitive in the sense that opposition parties had a realistic chance of winning elections, and stable in the sense that the same parties stuck around from election to election. Together, this competitiveness and stability had encouraged the traditional parties in Uruguay and Chile to reach out to less affluent sectors of society and open their ranks to popular participation as a way of gaining an advantage over their rivals. In the next two videos, we are now going to turn to a pair of countries that offered a less hospitable environment for this sort of mass party building in the early 20th century. And we are going to begin today with Costa Rica. Costa Rica had one of the most competitive political systems in Latin America during the early 20th century, but its parties were so short-lived during this period that no political leader was willing to take the time to build an enduring base of mass support in the same way that political leaders did in Uruguay and Chile. José Joaquín Rodríguez de León was a Costa Rican landowner and judge who felt alienated from the liberal establishment that had governed the country ever since the collapse of the Federal Republic of Central America. In 1889, he decides that he is going to mount the first major opposition presidential candidacy that the liberal establishment has faced in decades. To support his campaign, Rodríguez de León founds a new political party, which he calls the Constitutional Democratic Party. At the base of this party is a network of political clubs led mainly by workers and labor leaders who support Rodríguez de León out of a shared antipathy towards the liberal elite. These political clubs gained quite a bit of influence within the Constitutional Democratic Party organization, and 3 of the 7 members of the party's national directory are labor leaders. This working class support is the critical factor that gets Rodríguez de León elected president in 1889. When the incumbent liberal president attempts to annul this election result after the fact, the Constitutional Democratic Party's political clubs mobilize several thousand people out onto the streets in protest. And these post-election protests ultimately force the liberal president to relinquish power to Rodríguez de León in order to avert a civil war. And this brings over 6 decades of liberal rule in Costa Rica to an end. Shortly before his inauguration, Rodríguez de León gathers all of the Constitutional Democratic Party's leaders and activists together. He thanks them for their hard work on the campaign and for backing him during the election dispute, but then he shocks his supporters by formally dissolving the Constitutional Democratic Party. And he dismisses his activists by telling them, "Citizens, return to your homes. Your mission is complete. High politics is reserved for men of state." In other words, thanks for all of your hard campaign work, but I've got it from here. As far as Rodríguez de León is concerned, the party has already served its purpose by getting him elected president, and there is really no reason to keep it around now that he is in office. The fate of the Constitutional Democratic Party sets a precedent for Costa Rican politics for the next 4 decades. Many new parties emerge in Costa Rica over the following years, but very few of these parties stick around for more than a single election cycle. Instead, most parties are dissolved after the election is over, and if their former leaders ever need a party again, they simply found a new one to replace it. One advantage of this unusually fluid party system is that it spares Costa Rica the lengthy periods of single-party rule that were the norm in the rest of Central America at this time. Because every party is so weak and short-lived, and because Costa Rica's presidents are limited to just one single consecutive term in office, there is not much of an incumbency advantage in early 20th century Costa Rica. And the presidency frequently passes around from one party to another, offering different political elites a turn in power. Costa Rican political elites soon learn that they can win high office with the support of only a weak and disorganized party that they threw together just a couple of months before the election. So most political elites never really bother to construct a party organization that might endure for more than a couple of years. That just isn't necessary in a party system as fluid as Costa Rica's. And although some of these parties have names that might suggest that they stand for some principle or social group, most of these parties are really just electoral vehicles for a single elite politician. The party exists for the sole purpose of getting its founder elected president, and once it has served that purpose, it usually disappears for good, and its activists and low-level politicians migrate to some other party or they establish a new party of their own. Because these parties are so organizationally weak, they outsource the task of mobilizing votes in rural areas to a network of local political bosses known as gamonales. Sometimes these gamonales would perpetrate electoral fraud on behalf of the party that pays them, but more often than not, they can get the job done simply by dispensing patronage to the right people. These gamonales are mercenaries, not party activists. They do not feel any loyalty to any particular party, and they are generally happy to work for whichever party makes them the best offer. In the larger cities of the Central Valley, there is an organized labor movement during this time, and some elite politicians do attempt to attract labor support by running populist campaigns. But labor leaders never have very much influence in the government once the election is over. This situation persists in Costa Rica until the early 1930s, when a group of dissident elites from three of the largest parties come together to form a new political party called the National Republican Party. This party turns out to be so much stronger than the previous parties that Costa Rica has seen that its leaders decide that this one is probably worth keeping around. The National Republicans win the next 4 elections by huge margins, and they quickly establish their position as the new dominant party in Costa Rica. But even during this period of National Republican dominance, many of the features of the previous party system remain in place. The National Republican Party is only moderately better organized than Costa Rica's earlier parties. It does develop a network of political clubs, but these clubs are mostly short-lived organizations that are controlled from the top down by party leaders, and they are used mostly for dispensing patronage to voters. The National Republican Party as a whole is essentially a political machine, and its local clubs never obtain anywhere near the degree of influence in party affairs that the Bajista political clubs enjoyed in Uruguay during the same period. The National Republican Party eventually produces a reformist leader named Rafael Calderón Guardia, who resembles the Uruguayan leader Baye in some respects. Like Baye, Calderón Guardia mobilizes a base of mass support through top-down economic and social reforms, including the creation of a universal healthcare system, an 8-hour workday, and a social security system. But the mass following that these reforms generate is a personalistic following, not a partisan following. They are loyal to Calderón personally, but Calderón never makes any real attempt to mobilize them into his party in the same way that Baye did in Uruguay in the 1920s. Calderón recognizes that his National Republican Party is a political machine that is poorly suited for this sort of mass incorporation. And instead of trying to make his party more of a mass party, he calculates that it would be easier to rely on the organizational resources of the Catholic Church and Costa Rica's Communist Party, giving rise to a rather unusual coalition of machine politicians, progressive Catholics, and communists. Calderon's reformist government has several transformational and enduring accomplishments, but it does not leave behind any sort of mass-based political party similar to the parties that we saw in Uruguay and Chile. Costa Rica in the early 20th century has one of the most democratic political systems in Latin America at this time. And even after the rise of national Republican dominance, opposition parties still had a decent chance at winning congressional elections. But democracy alone is not enough to encourage elites to build strong multi-class parties. Mass party building is a long-term investment in a party's electoral future that may take decades to pay off. And there just isn't much incentive for anyone to undertake a long-term investment like this in a setting as fluid and unstable as Costa Rica's early 20th century party system.